Welcome back to Giant Monster Games. I'm Adrian, and today we are doing Golgari Hydras. Yes, that is right. It is basically a green Hydras deck with a couple black cards that we really want to be playing put into it. But before we actually get into breaking down the deck, don't forget to leave a like on this video. It helps with the channel a lot, and subscribe if you're not already so you can get updates whenever videos like this are coming out. Also, yeah, that voting thing's back up there so you can actually go and vote on what decks I may be making in the future. Okay, let's get into it, starting out with the two cards that make this deck kind of insane. We have 4 copies of Hardened Scales and 4 copies of Winding Constrictor. So both of these cards are kind of doing the same thing. Whenever a counter is put onto a card we control, we get to put another one of those counters. As you can guess, because we're playing a Hydras deck, we're going to be putting a bunch of 1/1 counters on all kinds of different stuff, which means whenever we put a counter on it, we're going to put another counter if we have 1, 2 extra counters if we have 2 of these, and 3 extra counters if we have 3 of these. It just constantly gets bigger and bigger depending on how many of these we have in play. But what actual Hydras are we running in the deck? Well, we have 2 copies of Mistcutter Hydra and 4 copies of Feral Hydra. At least these are the first 2 Hydras we're talking about. They're both X green, so we can actually be paying 2 mana and getting a 1/1, but if we have Winding Constrictor or Hardened Scales in play, they come in with extra tokens, so in some cases we'll be paying 1 green and 1 mana, and we'll be coming in with a 3/3 or a 4/4 if we have a bunch of those cards in play, which does happen once in a while. Feral Hydra also has the added benefit of being able to pay 3 and putting a 1/1 counter on it, so again, throughout the game, if we have extra mana just kind of hanging out, we can be putting a ton of extra stuff on this guy. Next, we have 4 copies of Protean Hydra and 4 copies of Managorger Hydra. Again, more Hydras because we're playing a Hydras deck. Protean Hydra is really good because, again, it is also X and green, but whenever a token is removed from it, we get to put more tokens back onto it, so it becomes really, really hard to deal with late game. Early game, it's not as amazing because it does kind of die really quickly, because generally this is kind of a spot removal target for most players, because this can get crazy and out of control, especially if we're chump blocking or they're chump blocking us. Managorger Hydra, on the other hand, is absolutely insane and is actually probably the best Hydra we have in this deck, because whenever someone casts a spell, it could be us or our opponent, we get to put a 1/1 counter on it. And as you might guess, as soon as we have a Hardened Scales or a Winding Constrictor in play, we get to put 2 counters on it every single time someone plays a spell. Oh, and it also has Trample, so when it gets big, it becomes extremely difficult for our opponent to play around. This card is absolutely awesome in this deck. So what kind of creatures do we have that are not Hydras? Well, we have 4 copies of Servant of the Scale and 4 copies of Scrounging Bandar. So both of these cards are significant because they both come in with counters right away, and they both have a way of getting rid of those counters and putting them onto another creature, which becomes extremely good. In particularly, Scrounging Bandar is amazing because every single turn we can just take 1 counter and put it onto another creature, and if we have, again, Hardened Scales or Winding Constrictor, that 1 counter turns into 2 counters. If we have 2 of these in play, we can basically just make them bigger and bigger by moving tokens back and forth between the 2 of them, just making them huge really quick. And Servant of Scales being really good because he has a 1-drop that comes with a counter, so again, he might be coming in as a 2/2 or a 3/3 later in the game, and then when he dies, we get to move all those counters onto another creature we control, which again, if those counters move somewhere else and we have a Winding Constrictor in play, say, they get more counters. So as you can see, we're kind of moving counters around a little bit and making things even bigger as we play the game, making our deck really hard to deal with unless they have some kind of wrath effect. And the last 2 creatures we have are 3 copies of Champion of Lambholt and 2 copies of Tuskguard Captain. Now, both of these cards are being used to actually allow us to push through in the late game and basically win. Captain of Lambholt is amazing because she gets a lot of counters out of it because we have 31 creatures in this deck. We have so many creatures that come into play that she gets big really quickly. And if we do have a Hardened Scales or Winding Constrictor in play, she gets even bigger, even faster, making it so a lot of our stuff becomes unblockable within like 2 turns of her coming into play. And Tuskguard Captain is just giving all of our stuff trample, which makes it really hard for our opponent to deal with, especially if they are running a bunch of chump blockers. Moving over to our removal package, we have 3 copies of Doomblade. We are black and green, so we may as well run Doomblade because immediate spot removal is always nice. And lastly, let's talk about our mana base lands. We have 2 copies of Evolving Wilds and 3 copies of Ghost Quarter. Obviously, Evolving Wilds is just a budget version of going and fetching specific lands we need, and Ghost Quarter is helping us with main deck hate against Tron and other decks that are running multicolored lands. Next, we have 4 copies of Lenoir Wastes. They're basically just giving us green and black mana. Hopefully, we don't have to use it too much. Late game, hopefully, we're just using it for its colorless mana, so we're not actually burning ourselves too much. And then we have 8 forests and 5 swamps. Obviously, this deck does want more green mana, so if you are playing it and you draw a hand and it doesn't have any green mana in it, you're gonna want to mulligan that because you're just not gonna be able to play the deck otherwise 99% of the time. So keep that in mind. And that is the entire main deck. Let's talk about our sideboard now. So we have 2 copies of Beast Within. This is just giving us some other spot removal if we are running up against something that's a little bit harder. Specifically, it targets permanents, so we can actually use it against Tron, we can use it against combo, we can use it a bunch of other stuff. So it's actually really good spot removal for permanents. 4 copies of Duress. This is obviously used against stuff that's going to give us hate. Obviously, we can't have our opponent wrathing our board, so we can use this to grab wrath effects. We can use this to get stuff out of Tron's hand. We can also use it to get stuff out of Combo's hand. So there's lots of stuff we can be doing with this deck. Obviously, not creatures, so keep that in mind. 3 copies of Nature's Claim. This has many uses. You guys can know what this is for. Destroying enchantments or artifacts. 2 copies of Rain of Tears. This is kind of giving us some other sideboard hate against Tron. It's not super effective, but it is better than nothing. 2 copies of Rite of Consumption. So if we're running up against a deck that just is not allowing us to attack in, so we are up against, say, Lantern Control or something of the sort, this is actually going to give us another way of dealing damage because we can just sack off one of our creatures and deal damage straight to our opponent, which is really good. And lastly, we have 2 copies of Vine of Vastwood. So if we are running up against a control-heavy deck, this is actually a really cheap way for us to keep creatures on the board. And normally we can also use this as a combat trick that'll actually win us the game. So if we are swinging with a big creature, and it is maybe going to be lethal or almost lethal, and our opponent decides it's going to remove it, we can just give it hexproof, pay the kicker cost, and then it gets +4/+4 as well, which is usually enough in this deck to push us over to the win. And that is the entire deck. If you are interested in picking this deck up or any other decks that have been on this channel, feel free to go over to Flipside Gaming. We have an affiliate sponsorship with them, so if you go there, order something online, and use coupon code GIANTMonsterGames, links in the description down below, you can actually get 10% off your order. So that is super rad if you guys are looking to save a little bit more money. Okay, let's talk about some upgrades now before we actually finish this entire video. The first thing I would recommend changing is the mana base. Obviously, mana bases for decks like this can always be upgraded. I would go with 3 copies of Ghost Quarters, 4 Overgrown Tombs, 2 Woodland Cemeteries, 4 Verdict Catacombs. If you can't afford them, you can also get Wooded Foothills, but Verdict Catacombs are just substantially better, 3 Swamps, and 6 Forests. This is what I would recommend if you are actually aiming to upgrade the mana base. As for other creatures that work really well in this deck, there are 3 ones that are rock stars that I would highly recommend changing out. Primordial Hydra, Hangerback Walker, and Walking Ballista. All for obvious reasons. Primordial Hydra gets just a ton of counters on it really quickly. Hangerback Walker is just going to get consistently bigger if you keep making it bigger, and then you're going to get a whole bunch of more tokens from it. And Walking Ballista, because you can be using it to spit out a ton of damage really easily. As far as removal is concerned, we are running black and green, so Abrupt Decay is a definite must if you are upgrading the removal package. Fatal Push is also really good in this deck because we do have a bunch of stuff that's bouncing in out of play, which is fine. And then lastly, Scavenging Ooze is usually really good in the sideboard. There's a ton of decks out there that just rely on having a bunch of stuff in their graveyard to be doing stuff, and Scavenging Ooze is just a really good way of dealing it, and it also gets counters on it, so that's also fantastic. Anyways, that is the entire deck. My name is Adrian, this is Giant Monster Games. You've just watched the Golgari Hydras deck. Leave a comment below on what you thought of the deck, and until next time, don't forget to game like a giant monster.